We are going to see the concept of data binding in a practical way, and for it, we're going to create a new project. Let's select the .NET Maui app template, and we will proceed to name it, for example, Data Binding Demo. We click on Create to create this project, and once we have created this project, we will proceed to define a model as part of the solution to start doing some tests. Then, on the project, we're going to indicate that we want to create a new folder and call it, for example, Models. We will indicate that we want to create a new class and we will name it, for example, Person. To this new class, we will indicate that we want it to be public, and we will create some properties, for example, a property called Name. We will also indicate that we want a second property called Phone. And finally, we indicate that we want a last property called Address. The next step is to go to the code of the initial page, that is the file mainpage.xaml.cs, and we see an event handler that is linked to the button that we have already seen multiple times. We're going to remove this content to take advantage of the event handler, and we're going to create a new instance of the class that we created, which is the Person class. We're going to import the namespace that is needed to not have any problems. That is, this namespace databindingdemo.models. And once we have done this, we're going to fill the information of each one of the properties with fictitious information, as for example, name equal to John. Let's put in a random phone number and finally a random address as well. Once we have filled in the event handler information that creates the instance of the person, let's go to the mainpage.xaml file. Let's reuse the scroll view and the vertical stack layout, so let's remove the controls that are inside the vertical stack layout, that is to say, this image control, these label controls, and we're going to leave the last button that is part of the stack layout. And in the superior part of the button, we're going to indicate that we want to create a label control. We're going to place a name to it that we will use later from the code behind, that is equal to txt name. Let's assign horizontal options equal to center, let's place a text equal to Hector, and font size equal to 50, so that we can see in a good way the content of this label. And let's also center the label. Once we have created the label control, let's go back to the code behind. And this is because we want to create our first binding as part of our application. How are we going to create the binding? Well, there is a class called binding. We're going to name this variable person binding, which is equal to a new instance of a binding. To create a binding, we need three ingredients. The first part we need is to specify which is going to be the source of information. We can do this by using the variable person binding, assigning a property called source, which will allow us to indicate what the source of information is. In our example, we want to obtain the information of this object that we were creating previously with certain information. Then, the source of the binding is going to be equal to the complete instance of the person. As I mentioned before, this source can be any .NET object that you may have as part of your project. It can even be a single property as part of the instance of the person. In our case, we're going to indicate that we want to use the whole person object. The next step is to specify which of all these properties that are part of this object is the one we want to bind to the particular control. As part of the binding, we have a property called path, which will allow us to specify through a string what is the name of the property. In our example, let's indicate that we want to create a binding to a property called name. Once we have defined the property to which we are going to bind the control, we must carry out the creation of the binding between the control and the property that we have specified. Remember in the slides I mentioned that we could only bind to properties that were bindable properties? Well, let's see what this is all about. I'm going to create a temporary entry element, let's call it for example txt address, which is equal to a new instance of an entry control. I'm going to go to the definition of the control, which is a class. And we can see a set of different properties that are of type bindable property, which are the properties to which we can bind an information source. In this case, we see this set of bindable properties. Each of the controls that are part of the framework and third-party controls will contain a set of properties of this type. When you read that a property is of type bindable property, you will know in advance that it will be a property that you will be able to access through the data binding. Let's close this class. I'm going to remove this element that I added previously, and let's proceed to establish the binding. How can we do it? Well, we have to access directly to the name of the control, which in this case is txt_name, to which I want to assign a value in the text property. Let's return to the code behind and let's indicate txt_name, and we have a method called setBinding that will allow us to establish the binding. If we see the definition as part of this method, we can see that as first parameter, a bindable property is accepted, and as a second parameter, a binding is accepted, which can be the instance binding that we created previously. What would be the bindable property? Well, it would be one of the properties that we saw earlier that are part of the control. In our case, as we are working with a label control, we have to access the label class, and we can see the set of bindable properties. As we want to establish the binding to the text property, let's indicate that we want to use this bindable property. And as a second parameter, let's indicate that we want to use the binding that we created earlier, which is this where we specify the source of information and the specific property from where we will extract the information. Once we have done this, let's proceed to start the application. Let's select, for example, that we want to use the Windows machine. Here we can see the application being executed. We see an initial value that was the one that we specified from the XAML code, and if we proceed to click on the button, automatically the content of the label changes to a new name since we are creating the binding that we specified previously from the C# code. With this, you have created your first binding. Remember, you need to create a binding specifying the source of information and finally establish the source to the bindable property, which will take the data from the information source, which in this case is the property called name.